Now, 1984, being the novel that it is, requires a good insight into some of the direct quotes and the way the quotes work for different themes and different ideas. I've broken it down into a couple of different concepts that work across both Metropolis and 1984. The first, of course, being politics and power. Why would you do anything different? So here we have a couple of key quotes that really strike the reader. The first one: the inhabitants of these areas, reduced more or less openly to the status of slaves, pass continually from conqueror to conqueror, and are expended like so much coal or oil in the race to turn out more armaments, to capture more territory, to control more labour power, to turn out more armaments, to capture more territory, and so on indefinitely. You will notice something very important, and the thing that matters here, that is really, really vital, is this bit. The status of slaves. That's exactly what Metropolis was suggesting. That both of these texts link in the way in which the worker and those who control the worker sort of fall into place. It's a political reality that both texts suggest is an inevitability when it comes to hierarchical structures and so forth. So this is from Goldstein's Manifesto. And remember, of course, when you're looking at this text, Goldstein's Manifesto is very similar to the way in which Maria in Metropolis tells stories that are biblical. And they talk about the nature of the human condition in very much the same way. And that underpins and underscores what's going on in the main text or in the main story. So don't neglect some of these different quotes. That's a really good one. And of course, if you're trying to deconstruct the language, you might talk about repetition there, the cyclical nature of what's going on. The next one: ever since the end of the 19th century, the problem of what to do with surplus of consumption of goods has been latent in industrial society. At present, when few human beings even have enough to eat, this problem is obviously not urgent, and it might not have become so even if no artificial processes of destruction had been at work. The idea, of course, that in any system the economy is driven by a certain set of laws that govern the way behaviours of markets exist. And so an industrialised society with a centralised government and institution must fall into this kind of total order. Otherwise it will fall into Metropolis type of total chaos. If it once became general, wealth would confer no distinction. It was possible, no doubt, to imagine a society in which wealth, in the sense of personal possessions and luxuries, should be evenly distributed, while power remained in the hands of a small privileged caste. But in practice, such a society could not long remain stable, for if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate and would learn to think for themselves. And when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realise that the privileged minority had no function and would sweep it away. Now, this concept, this is a political or philosophical idea here. In 1984, this is what Winston feels is the proles' position, what they will be able to do, and that is sweep away those in power, because once they become literate and engaged politically, there's no stopping them. And so the argument is that it's important for those in power to keep people deliberately disengaged in politics, to suggest that the political world is corrupt, to show its corruption on the surface, to point that out, and therefore people become disengaged, they become uninterested, and they start to decide that all political class and all powerful class are corrupt anyway, so what's the point of even trying? In Metropolis, this is why Friedeson fears these mass gatherings that Maria sets up, because those stories are increasing at least the storybook literacy of the workers. They are putting ideas into the workers, and this is why the thing he decides to create as a corruption is a doppelganger version of that Maria. So he's able to force the corruption into the system in a very sinister way and sinister method. So the argument here by Orwell is that poor people don't rise up because they don't want to rise up, because they don't see any purpose in rising up. And so what he suggests is this privileged minority here must understand that they have a tenuous hold on power at all times, hence the need in 1984 for excessive and extreme violence, and the need in Metropolis for conspiracy. So that sort of answers those kind of questions as to why these people are motivated to do what they do. Between life and death, and between physical pleasure and physical pain, there is still a distinction, but that is all. Cut off from contact with the outer world and with the past, the citizen of Oceania is like a man in interstellar space who has no way of knowing which direction is up and which is down. The rulers of such a state are absolute, as the pharaohs or the Caesars could not be. They are obliged to prevent their followers from starving to death in numbers large enough to be inconvenient, and they are obliged to remain at the same low level of military technique as their rivals. But once that minimum is achieved, they can twist reality into whatever shape they choose. So the suggestion here, of course, is that the ultimate power of Big Brother is a further step on from other despots, from other types of absolute states like those of Egypt and those of Rome. This is a new way of thinking. Certainly there are obligations. There are basic obligations that must be adhered to. Prevent followers from starving to death, at least in numbers large enough to be inconvenient. You get this dismissive, non-emotional language when it comes to life and death that is typical of the language of power. And they are obliged to, of course, maintain military. But after that, all they have to do is create a version of reality. If you do this, cut off contact with the outer world, reality can be shaped and manipulated in any way you desire. And that is where power does come into play. The aims of these three groups are entirely irreconcilable. The aim of the high is to remain where they are. The aim of the middle is to change places with the high. The aim of the low, when they have an aim, for it is an abiding characteristic of the low that they are too much crushed by drudgery to be more than intermittently conscious of anything outside their daily lives, is to abolish all distinctions and create a society in which all men should be equal. This, of course, gives us an idea that the concept of equality that the low want is not really something that's going to work. The low, of course, don't like to maintain a hierarchy that seems to be the natural state of things. The drudgery of the proles, and even the drudgery of members of the outer party, mean that it is too hard to rise up. The drudgery of those workers in Metropolis was something that held them in check for a long time, but eventually, of course, they break through. What Orwell is doing is that 20 years later, the suggestion is that stories like Metropolis and ideas like that are mere fairy tales. They're fantasies. They do not have any bearing or notion of reality. So if you're making any comparison, really another way of looking at it is saying 1984 has almost a direct attack on some of the simplistic notions that come out of Metropolis. The simple ideas of a mediator, the rather basic aphorisms or aphorism that occurs with the head and the heart must have the mediator, and all this business seems to be, for at least Orwell, blatantly stupid. He feels that really this idea of a hierarchy is inevitable, and here he uses the word irreconcilable, and that tells us that Metropolis is a failure in terms of a story. So really, one way to look at it is starting with an idea, closing off that idea with 1984, setting up an impossibility in many ways. Perhaps the most terrifying image that strikes from 1984, and one that is perpetual, is not necessarily that of the telescreens, but that of the thought police. The concept of controlling one's mind is not a new one, but controlling it to such an extent that is found in 1984 is certainly profound. And to me, probably one of the most terrifying quotes from the novel, the one that gets me every time, is this one. Because this is a boy. And the boy is playing a game. He's not actually doing anything bad or sinister here. He's just playing a game in the background whilst Winston is helping the boy's mother fix the sink. A very ordinary, a very mundane moment in Winston's day. But this is going on in the background. "You're a traitor," yelled the boy. "You're a thought criminal. You're a Eurasian spy. I'll shoot you. I'll vaporize you. I'll send you to the salt mines." Nothing unusual about that. Children in our own world play games that can either be based on wars and based on certain ideas. One only need look at things like Fortnite to know that's a reality. But what's being pointed out here is that manipulation of youth, the way in which children are so open to behave in this way, in this kind of collective way of thinking. Their individuality is certainly not something that has come to fruition at this age yet. Properly, they haven't built a code of ethics and they haven't built a code of empathy because they don't have the experience or even the brain capacity to do so at their childhood age. They are immediately indoctrinated into the concept of the thought police, and they're using the language of the thought police. And that in of itself shows you how immediately dangerous such a world is, because with every generation it digs its heels in even further and becomes harder and harder to remove. That is how certain traditions start, be they good, bad, or indifferent. And the use of youth and children here, not entirely unusual in sets of context. One need only think of things like Hitler Youth, gives it a truly terrifying reality. So as a quote, it hits home. The children in Metropolis are shown as innocents. They're shown as members of purity, and they're surrounding Maria when we meet Maria as she arrives in the pleasure garden to overwhelm Frida. That really is, again, a rose-coloured romantic view of childhood. That all children are innocent, and to be brought to our innocent selves, and childhood is this beautiful, amazing time, and all that kind of stuff. And in reality, children are very capable of doing very, very dangerous things. And so Orwell doesn't pull any punches here. He gives ugliness to the children as much to the adults, and in that way that belies any sense of hope or alternative for this world. Here, with a longer quote, we see the idea extended a bit further. "Nearly all children nowadays were horrible. What was worst of all was that by the means of such organisations they were systematically turned into ungovernable little savages." Lots of emotive language here. Lots of nasty language here. This is the true sinister nature of Oceania. A child hero has dobbed someone in, overheard some compromising remark, and denounced its parents to the thought police. Two things are occurring there, of course, is the control of or destruction of the family unit and the absolute power of the future. So this is something that really, really rings true in this novel, and it's something that you need to really consider on understanding its full capacity to create a speculative future of great fear, terror, and tyranny. Very, very frightening. And the final quote I'm interested in talking about just for this particular video is, of course, the very famous moment where Winston does his betrayal to Julia here. Do it to Julia, do it to Julia, tear her face off. When he is faced with his ultimate fear and complete tortuous reality. Now, it's easy to say, "Oh, betrayed her, isn't that sad? Oh, that's the sad ending to a book. Oh, how very bleak." Okay. Yeah, it is bleak. And it is sad, but all you're doing with that is allowing yourself to rather think about things in a simplistic fashion. Because what you have here is Winston, who is the protagonist. He's been set up in many ways to create a sense of hope for the reader. He is, in this novel, our mediator. He's our character who represents what Frida represents. It would seem, at least in the first chapter and parts of the second chapter, that seemed to be true. But of course here, all of that is turned on its head. So Orwell is deliberately manipulating the idea of protagonist-antagonist, and he's taking us for a ride. He's set up someone who's meant to be heroic, and he's given him the ultimate sort of villainous moment of total betrayal and absolute treason against his lover. This is pathetic behaviour. And because of that, we immediately have everything torn away from us. That was a sense of this world coming to an end. It's a perfect, perfect ending, not a sad one or a bleak one, a perfect one. And it rings right against Metropolis's very weak and very poor conclusion. Metropolis, as you know, descends into almost this ridiculous in the last 25 minutes. It just becomes this thing, this chase on the rooftops, and then the absolutely rather strange moment of head and heart and mediator and hands and so forth. Here we get something that is far more terrifying. So keep that as something important when you're making links.